Welcome to this trip through one of Georgia's most disturbing cases ever. Before we start, please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. We want to know where and when these documented accounts are getting to people. In the fall of 1846, on a certain Tuesday, rumors about the Preston twins started to spread through Savannah. The wealthy single sisters, who lived in a big plantation house about 17 miles west of the city, were said to have made a very strange announcement at a gathering of the county's elite. People who were there said that they had introduced two well-dressed men as their new husbands. What shocked proper Georgian society the most about this announcement was not just that the sisters had married on the same day without telling anyone beforehand. It was also what some guests later whispered about the grooms. Men who, despite looking nice that night, were known to have been slaves on the Preston estate. People in Savannah had been talking about the Preston family for a long time. After their parents died in a carriage accident in 1839, the twins, Elizabeth and Margaret, got Willow Creek Plantation. They never hired a man or a relative to take care of their large property, which is unusual for women of their social class. Instead, they were in charge of everything that happened on the plantation and the about 73 people they enslaved. People knew the sisters for their strange habits and how they stayed to themselves. They didn't go to many social events and didn't get many visitors at their estate. The Preston twins' looks were what stood out to people in Savannah. The sisters were 34 years old when these things happened. They were born in 1812. Many people thought it was unfortunate that they had very similar features, such as heavy-set bodies, unusually prominent facial features, and skin that showed early signs of aging. People had been making fun of them for their looks since they were kids, and they got nicknames that were not nice that spread through drawing rooms all over the county. The twins seemed to have turned inward after being rejected by society, which made their strange bond stronger and made them even more alone from normal people. Dr. Samuel Wilson, the Preston family's doctor, wrote the first official record about the scandal in his journal. His entry from September 28, 1846, notes being summoned to Willow Creek under mysterious circumstances. Called to the Preston estate this evening on urgent business, he wrote, the nature of which was not disclosed in the message. Upon arrival, I was most perplexed to find Miss Elizabeth and Miss Margaret in seemingly good health, seated in the parlor with two male Negroes dressed in gentlemen's clothing. The sisters introduced these men as Mr. James and Mr. William, referring to them with surnames I shall not commit to paper. More disturbing still, they addressed these men as husband. When I expressed my shock, Miss Elizabeth calmly requested I record two marriages in the family Bible, claiming the ceremonies had been conducted privately the previous Sunday. I departed without fulfilling this inappropriate request and am greatly troubled by what appears to be a dangerous mental disturbance affecting both sisters simultaneously. Reverend Thomas Blackwell of St. John's Episcopal Church soon confirmed what the doctor had said. In a letter to his bishop, he said that he had turned down a large donation from the Preston sisters after they asked him to retroactively recognize their unholy and impossible unions. The Reverend said that the sisters were perfectly sane but morally insensate, and he was worried that their mental faculties were still intact while their moral compass had become very distorted. After that, the Preston twins stayed out of the public eye for about 3 months. Deliveries to the plantation went on as usual, but no one came to visit. Later, merchants who supplied the estate said that orders changed slightly during this time. The usual amounts of food went up, and the lists started to include requests for nice fabrics, men's toiletries, and other high-end goods. Most importantly, a jeweler in Savannah said that the Preston family paid him to make 2 matching gold rings in men's sizes. During this time, it seemed like the plantation's work went on without any problems. Cotton harvests came on time, bills were paid on time, and neighboring landowners didn't notice anything strange happening. The only strange thing that people who did business on the property reported was that the sisters were not there, even though they had been in charge of all transactions before. Instead, they were given written instructions with what looked like Elizabeth Preston's signature on them. In January 1847, Charles Montgomery, the sheriff of the county, got a letter from Margaret Preston's distant cousin in Charleston. This was the first big event. This letter, which is still in the county's records, said that the rumors about his cousins were worrying and asked for an official welfare check. Montgomery's next report says that when he went to Willow Creek Plantation, Elizabeth Preston was the only person who welcomed him into the main house. She seemed calm, but her appearance had changed a little. She told the sheriff that everything was fine, and that the rumors were just the result of jealous and bored neighbors talking. Elizabeth is said to have told Montgomery that her sister was sick and that the men in question were just trusted servants who had been given extra duties in running the estate. The sheriff left with his suspicions still unresolved, but no legal reason to look into the plantation further because he saw that it was running smoothly. There are bits and pieces of information about what happened next in letters between local officials, church records, and the private journals of plantation owners who lived nearby. When put together, these stories show a community that was torn between moral outrage, morbid curiosity, and not knowing how to deal with a situation that went against the social norms and laws of the time. A letter from Elizabeth Preston to the family's lawyer in Savannah came out in March 1847. This was an important document. In this letter, she told him to change the Preston will so that the estate would be split evenly between her, her sister, and their legal husbands, whom she named with last names that matched their own. Robert Fleming, the lawyer, did not follow these instructions. Instead, he called several men in the Preston family and asked them to step in. He wrote to a cousin in Atlanta and said that the situation was a matter of the gravest concern. He said that it was threatening not only the family name, but the very social order upon which our way of life depends. The events that followed happened in a slow, southern way, not quickly, but surely. In early April, 3 male relatives came from Atlanta and Augusta with Dr. Wilson and a mental health expert from the Georgia State Asylum. Dr. Wilson later wrote in his journal that their goal was to check on the sisters' mental health and, if necessary, take them to the asylum for treatment. There are many different stories about what they found when they got to Willow Creek, but they all have major differences that make it seem like the stories are either exaggerated or trying to hide the more disturbing parts. The journal of Dr. Edward Hayes, the asylum specialist, has the most complete account. He wrote, "When we got to Willow Creek, we found the main house in a condition that is hard to describe. The parlor and dining room were furnished as you would expect in a house of that status, but the master bedrooms were set up in a way that made it look like the sisters were living with men. Even worse, these men were on the property, dressed in fine clothes that were clearly bought for gentlemen rather than appropriate for their station. At first, they tried to keep us from entering certain rooms, speaking with an authority that no enslaved person should have. When confronted by the male relatives, these 2 men, who looked very much alike despite not being related by blood, showed no fear or respect, instead acting like they were the real masters of the house." The account continues. The sisters, when finally located in the East Wing sitting room, presented an altered appearance from their last documented observation. Both had arranged their hair in elaborate styles more suited to younger women, wore expensive gowns, and were adorned with jewelry typically reserved for married ladies of standing. Most notably, both wore wedding bands. Their physical appearance, however, was unchanged, their unfortunate features perhaps even more pronounced by their attempts at beautification. Upon being informed of our purpose, both became agitated, but not in the manner of the merely hysterical. Instead, they exhibited a cold, calculating resistance, with Elizabeth informing us that we were unwelcome trespassers on private property, while Margaret summoned the male Negroes, referring to them as "my husband" and "my sister's husband" without any apparent shame. What happened next was a hard process of getting the sisters out of their house. The men, they said were their husbands, were quickly tied up and taken to the slave quarters. Dr. Hayes says that this separation made the sisters feel something real for the first time, even though they had been acting strangely calm up until then. Miss Elizabeth, upon seeing the man she called James being forcibly removed, emitted a sound I have never before heard from a human throat. Not quite a scream, not merely a wail, but something that suggested a profound severing. Miss Margaret collapsed entirely, requiring physical support to remain upright. That same day, the sisters were taken to Savannah and stayed with a distant relative until arrangements were made for them to be moved to the asylum in Milledgeville. During this time, Elizabeth Preston was able to send a letter to the family's lawyer, which was later found among his papers. In it, she wrote very clearly, "You completely misunderstand our situation. We are not deluded or confused. We have simply chosen to be honest about what many plantation mistresses hide, that the lines between master and slave sometimes blur in the privacy of night. Our sin was not in what we did, but in being honest. James and William are as much our husbands, in fact, as any man is to any woman in this hypocritical society. That we chose to honor this truth instead of hiding it like a shameful secret is our only crime against Southern propriety." No one ever replied to this letter. On the 15th of April, 1847, Elizabeth and Margaret Preston were admitted to the Georgia State Asylum with a diagnosis of moral insanity and erotomania. At the time, these conditions were thought to mostly affect women and show up as irrational attachments and inappropriate desires that went against social norms while leaving the mind intact. Henry Preston, a cousin from Augusta, took over running Willow Creek Plantation after that. He quickly ordered an inventory of the property. The sisters' private rooms contained some strange things, such as 2 journals written in a code that was never broken, a collection of daguerreotypes showing the sisters with the 2 men they claimed were their husbands, and a variety of personal items belonging to these men that would have been very valuable to enslaved people, such as gold, cufflinks, pocket watches, and books. Official records don't say much about what happened to James and William, the 2 men who were killed. Henry Preston's plantation ledger has one entry that says 2 problematic influences were removed in late April. A credit entry suggests that they were sold to a trader who specializes in markets farther south, probably in New Orleans, or maybe even for export to Cuba or Brazil. The Preston sisters lived at the Georgia State Asylum for about 3 years. Treatment records show that the standard procedures of the time for female mental patients were used on them, such as cold water treatments, isolation, and different sedatives. Attending doctors said that the women kept calling themselves Mrs. instead of Miss, and sometimes asked about the health of the men they thought were their husbands. After it was found that they were sending each other coded messages when they were allowed to talk, they were given separate quarters. In January 1850, Margaret Preston died in the asylum from what was called wasting disease. However, a modern look at the symptoms described suggests tuberculosis, which was common in institutions at the time. Elizabeth lived until October of that year, when she died after refusing to eat for several weeks, according to reports. The attending physician noted in his final report that she had become increasingly withdrawn after her sister's death, speaking only to ask about James or to request writing materials, which were denied due to concern she would attempt to contact accomplices outside the institution. The Preston family planned quiet burials in the family plot near Savannah, with simple markers that didn't include the dates of death. This was a common way to try to lessen the stigma of being in an asylum and having mental illness. Henry Preston ran Willow Creek Plantation until 1861, when Union troops marching through Georgia destroyed a lot of the property during Sherman's March to the Sea. During Reconstruction, the land was sold in pieces. The main house was partially rebuilt and changed hands several times before it burned down completely in 1912. Interest in the Preston case stayed low until 1963, when historian Eleanor Hammond found the asylum records while working on her PhD thesis about how women with mental health problems were treated in the antebellum South. Her next paper, Moral Insanity, The Case of the Preston Twins, got the story a lot of attention in the academic world, but she mostly used it as an example of how women's defiance of social norms was seen as a mental illness and punished with medical treatment. The most interesting thing happened in 1967, when workmen found a hidden compartment in an old law office in Savannah that held what looked like personal papers belonging to Robert Fleming, the Preston family's lawyer. One of these was a sealed envelope with the name of Elizabeth Preston on it, which handwriting experts later confirmed was her script. The letter inside, which was written on the 12th of April, 1847, just days before the sisters were put in a mental hospital, is the only known account of what happened from her point of view. She wrote, "What no one will understand is that our crime was not one of impropriety, but of recognition. James and William were born as property, yes, but nature gave them minds and hearts that are better than most men we know. Our Father secretly taught them, knowing they were special, but not having the courage to say so in public. For 7 years after our parents died, they have been our true companions, helping us run this estate and keeping our hearts private. The profits of Willow Creek have doubled under their guidance, though we took the credit to avoid scrutiny. That society cannot see the dignity in these men while celebrating the most brutal and ignorant among the planter class just because of an accident of birth shows the true madness which is not in our minds, but in the contradictions on which our society is built. The letter goes on for several pages, giving details about the sisters' relationships and their choice to make their plans public even though they knew what might happen. Elizabeth said, "It is a sacrifice we make willingly, a testament that might survive even if we do not. Proof that even in this darkest of times and places, real love can go beyond the fake walls that men have built." Her last paragraph is the most powerful. "I have no illusions about our fate or that of our loved ones. Southern society will destroy what it does not understand, and it understands very little beyond its own narrow codes and hypocrisies. But I write this so that someone, someday, might know that in the spring of 1846, 4 people dared to live honestly on a plantation west of Savannah, creating a small world of equality within a larger one built on its opposite. For 9 months, we experienced what might be possible in a more enlightened age. It is for this brief triumph, rather than our inevitable defeat, that I wish to be remembered." Historians have argued about whether this letter is real or not. Some say it could be a forgery made later to make an already strange case more interesting. Some people say that linguistic analysis and comparing Elizabeth Preston's handwriting to known samples of her letters prove that the letters are real. The Georgia Historical Society still has the document in its archives, where it is listed as unverified, but of great historical interest. The most haunting part of the Preston case isn't in any official record. It's in an oral history collected from a woman named Sarah Johnson, who was interviewed in 1937 as part of the Federal Writers Project's work on people who had been enslaved. Johnson, who was about 102 years old at the time, had been a slave on a plantation next to Willow Creek when she was a young woman. When asked if she remembered anything about the Preston twins, she didn't say anything for a few minutes before answering, "Those poor ugly ladies," she is said to have said. People said they went crazy, but they weren't crazy. They just forgot where they were. They thought they were people first and white women second. Down here, it's always the other way around. You can't put people first in a place that was built to keep some people from being people at all. Johnson shook her head when asked for more information about the men involved. Both of them were good-looking boys, too good-looking for their own good. People don't talk about what happened to them after. Some things are too terrible to remember. The interviewer noted that Johnson refused to say more and quickly changed the subject, suggesting that whatever she knew about the men's ultimate fate was something she didn't want to talk about. The story of the Preston twins and their supposed husbands is only a small part of history, with bits and pieces found in asylum records, personal letters, legal documents, and oral histories. The truth about what happened at Willow Creek Plantation in the 9 months from 1846 to 1847, the private truths behind the public scandal, will never be fully known. The main people involved didn't leave many direct testimonies, and the ones that do exist were affected by the views and biases of their time. It is evident that within the inflexible societal framework of antebellum Georgia, the Preston sisters perpetrated what may have been the most egregious offense imaginable. Whether motivated by authentic affection, psychological idiosyncrasy, or a confluence of factors, they not only transgressed the most prohibited boundary of their time, but did so overtly, contesting the essential social, racial, and gender hierarchies that underpin their society. For this, they lost their freedom, their home, and eventually their lives. The last known mention of the Preston case is in a letter written in 1958 by the last living direct descendant of Henry Preston. She talks about giving the family Bible to a historical society and says, "I've taken out the page where someone, probably Elizabeth, wrote those 2 inappropriate entries. Some family stories are best left alone, especially when they only show how disturbed the mind and character are. The past has enough weight without keeping its darkest chapters. That page has never been found. This part of the story, like so many others, is now just an absence, a planned silence where proof used to be. The real story of what happened at Willow Creek Plantation is still stuck between documented bits and the huge, unrecorded reality of human experience. Maybe Elizabeth Preston wanted it this way, still waiting for a time when people can understand it without passing judgment. There are only foundation stones and a small family cemetery overgrown with Georgia pines left of Willow Creek Plantation today. Some people who live in the area say they hear strange noises on some autumn evenings. Some say they hear two women talking animatedly, with men laughing. Historians and rationalists say that these stories are based on the fact that people tend to add supernatural elements to stories about real-life tragedies. But for those who have stood on that lonely plot as twilight falls, there is still the unsettling feeling of hearing the echo of something that once defied its time. Four voices talking to each other as equals, still echoing across the centuries in a place where that should have been impossible. There is only one daguerreotype left in the county archives after the Preston family materials were thrown away. It is a formal portrait of two plain-faced women in fancy clothes sitting next to two very handsome men standing behind them. There are no names on the back, no date, and the catalog only says, "Unidentified Savannah residence, circa 1845. When the archivist found it again in 1966, they only noted that the composition was unusual for its time because the two men were positioned in a way that was more typical of family members than servants. But what the picture shows that no written record could fully convey is the clear look of happiness on four faces, each looking directly into the camera as equals, united in a moment of shared dignity that their world was not yet ready to see or understand. In 1968, a graduate student looking into the history of the Georgia State Asylum found some records that had been filed incorrectly for decades. One of these papers was a detailed log of Elizabeth Preston's treatment during her last few months at the institution. Dr. Jonathan Miller, the attending physician, kept more detailed notes than was common at the time, as he seemed fascinated by what he called a most unusual case of feminine moral degradation. His notes give us a chilling look at Elizabeth's mental state as her health got worse after her sister died. Miller wrote in August 1850 that patient EP continues to maintain the delusion regarding her inappropriate attachment. Despite 39 months of treatment, including cold water therapy, isolation, and administration of laudanum and other sedatives, she exhibits no recognition of her moral failing. Most disturbing is her continued lucidity on all matters unrelated to her professed marriage. She can discuss literature, politics, and plantation management with surprising clarity and intelligence, only to lapse into her fantasy when conversation turns to personal matters. Miller's notes have written records of conversations he had with Elizabeth, including one very interesting one from September 12, about a month before she died. When I asked her if she now understood how wrong her past actions were, the patient said, "What you call wrong, doctor, future generations will see as brave." The world changes, morals change, and what seems terrible in one age becomes just ahead of its time in another. I have no regrets, except that I couldn't protect those I loved from the consequences of my choices. This statement, notable for its defiance and foresight, indicates that Elizabeth upheld her beliefs until the end, despite the deterioration of her physical health. Miller saw this as proof that she was morally insane and couldn't be cured, not as a sign of her strength. He said, "The patient's inability to recognize her degraded condition, even in the face of divine punishment through illness, demonstrates the profound depth of her depravity." Miller's account of Elizabeth's last days is perhaps the most revealing. His logs say that she stopped eating in late September and only drank water. When asked about this choice, she reportedly said, "I have seen all I want to see of this world. Margaret is waiting for me in the next one, and maybe there we will find James and William as well." In a place where men's laws don't matter to the heart's truth, her deliberate starvation, instead of being seen as a logical way to end her suffering, was seen as more proof of her mental instability. Miller wrote down his last conversation with Elizabeth Preston on the morning of the 7th of October, 1850. Found patient, extremely weakened, but still conscious. When informed that her condition was grave and that spiritual counsel was available should she wish to repent before meeting her Maker, she smiled for the first time in my observation and whispered, "I have nothing to repent. I loved truly. Few can say as much." She died later that evening, with the official cause recorded as nervous decline following melancholia. In 1969, a descendant of a former Willow Creek slave contacted the Georgia Historical Society with a family oral history that had been passed down through the years. This gave us more information about the Preston case. This story says that James and William were not born on the Preston plantation. Instead, Thomas Preston, the twins' father, bought them when they were about 16 years old. These young men were chosen for their intelligence and looks, which is different from most enslaved people who were bought to work on plantations. Thomas Preston is said to have said that he would train them to work in the house. The oral history said that the older Preston had secretly taught both young men how to read, write, and keep track of their money. At the time, it was against the law for enslaved people in Georgia to have these skills. After Thomas Preston died, the twins apparently kept up and even expanded this education, slowly giving the two men more and more important jobs in the household and on the plantation. What was most interesting about this family story was that it said the twins' relationships with these men had changed over the 7 years since their parents died. At first, they were like a master and servant, but over time, they became more complex and mutual. It is said that all four people decided to publicly call these relationships marriages after years of pretending they weren't. This was a deliberate political move, not just a social scandal. This story is hard to check on its own, but it could explain why the Preston sisters planned their actions so carefully. Instead of a sudden plunge into moral insanity, their actions seem more in line with a planned risk taken by people who had set up a different social order in private and chose to go against public norms even though they knew what would probably happen. In 1972, an archaeological dig at the Willow Creek site found the foundation of a small building about 100 yards from the main house foundations. This gave more weight to this interpretation. There are no records of this building in any surviving plantation records, but it had artifacts that suggested it had been a private living space of unusual quality. Some of the things that were found were pieces of imported porcelain, good writing tools, and, most surprisingly, a hidden compartment under the floorboards that held a small collection of books on philosophy, math, and political theory. These books would have been very unusual for anyone other than educated white men to read at that time. Dr. Richard Thompson, the archaeologist in charge of the dig, wrote in his report that the building seemed to have been built on purpose to give people privacy and dignity. The furnishings were more like those found in a gentleman's quarters than in a typical slave cabin of the time. He thought that this building might have been a private getaway, where the sisters and their chosen companions could spend time together without being seen by other enslaved people or visitors. This would have kept up the appearance of a normal plantation hierarchy while creating a separate, hidden world. In 1974, more proof came to light when a set of business records from a New Orleans slave trader was given to Tulane University. One of these documents was a sales record from the 18th of May, 1847, that showed the purchase of 2 prime specimens, age approximately 30 years each, unusually educated, previously held in Georgia. The record said that these people had been sold to a coffee plantation owner from Brazil who was looking for enslaved people with management experience to help him grow his business. Even though the names in this record don't match those of the Preston twins' friends, the timing, origin, and strange way these men are described as educated make it very likely that they are the same people. If this is the case, this document is the only sign of what happened to them after they were taken away from Willow Creek. The Brazilian destination is especially important because slavery didn't end in Brazil until 1888, long after it ended in the United States. This means that these men would never be able to go back to Georgia or tell their side of the story. One of the most convincing pieces of evidence that the Preston story is true came from an unexpected source. In 1978, a researcher at the University of Georgia found a series of strange notes in the margin of a plantation ledger from a nearby property. These notes, which were written in a very small hand, seemed to be a record of what people saw on the Preston estate during the important years of 1846 to 1,847. The author, who was probably an overseer or manager at the nearby plantation, wrote that he saw the twin mistresses walking around the grounds with their favorite men, all four of them talking to each other as if they were equals. He also wrote that lights were burning until dawn in the separate quarter where unnatural arrangements are conducted. Most importantly, this observer noted that after the Preston sisters were taken away in April 1847, there was a brief but intense search of the plantation grounds led by the new manager, Henry Preston. The margin notes say that this search was mostly about finding papers and proof of bad behavior. The writer said they heard from a slave who had seen a lot of papers and personal items being burned in the orchard. These included what looked like letters, journals, and a few small portraits. This account suggests that someone tried to get rid of evidence of the true nature of the relationships at Willow Creek on purpose. This might explain why so few direct records from the people involved have survived. The effort to erase this history went beyond just social embarrassment. It was a planned effort to get rid of anything that might make the people involved seem more human, or make their choices seem more credible. In 1982, feminist historian Dr. Catherine Marshall published Against the Grain: Women Who Defied Antebellum Social Codes, which brought the Preston case back into the news. Her chapter on the Preston twins changed the way we think about their story. Instead of being about mental illness or moral failure, it was about an early, though ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to fight the intersecting oppressions of race and gender that defined Southern society. Marshall said that the sisters' actions were a clear rejection of the basic myths of white Southern womanhood, especially the idea that white women needed to be protected from black men. This idea was the basis for both slavery and the patriarchal control of white women's sexuality. Marshall wrote that the Preston twins struck at the core contradiction of the Southern social system, that black men could be simultaneously dehumanized as property and feared as threats to white women's virtue. Their actions showed how hypocritical a society that allowed sexual exploitation while violently punishing consensual relationships that challenged racial hierarchy was. Traditional historians criticized Marshall's analysis because they thought it was wrong to give 19th-century people modern political consciousness. Elizabeth Preston's own words in her recovered letter, "A testament that might survive even if we do not. Proof that even in this darkest of times and places, genuine affection can transcend the artificial boundaries erected by men, imply a degree of intentionality and awareness that supports Marshall's interpretation." In 1993, another part of the story came to light when descendants of the Johnson family, whose ancestor had given testimony to the Federal Writers Project, came forward with more oral history about what happened to James and William. This family story, which has been passed down through the years, says that the men were not taken out of Georgia right away after being taken from Willow Creek. They had instead been held for a short time at a trader's compound outside of Savannah while plans were made for their sale. The Johnson family says that during this time, a small group of free black dock workers in Savannah found out about their situation and tried to get in touch. These men were part of a secret group that sometimes helped enslaved people escape. They are said to have been able to send a message offering help with escape. The response, which has been passed down through this oral tradition, was both touching and revealing. "We thank you for your bravery, but our loved ones are beyond your help or ours. If we can't live openly as we choose, we won't live secretly in fear. Remember us as men who were briefly husbands and masters of our fate, not as fugitives." If this story is true, it means that James and William, like the Preston sisters, knew exactly what would happen when they took a public stand. They chose to be martyrs for their beliefs rather than giving up their larger fight against the system in order to save their own freedom. This story fits with the amazing calmness and conviction that Elizabeth Preston kept up until her death, even though it is impossible to check on its own. The most recent addition to the historical record was made in 2003, when a diary that had never been seen before was found while an old house in Milledgeville, Georgia, was being fixed up. A junior attendant at the Georgia State Asylum kept this journal from 1848 to 1851. It has a lot of entries about the Preston sisters. The attendant wrote down that Margaret Preston had made a small pencil drawing in the weeks before her death and had hidden it under her mattress. "Patient in room 17 passed this morning," reads the entry from January 23, 1850. Upon stripping her bedding, I discovered a crude drawing concealed in the seam of the mattress. It depicted 4 figures standing together before what appeared to be a large house. Though the artistry was poor, the care taken in the details of their faces was remarkable. Most unusual was that all 4 figures were holding hands. I showed it to Dr. Miller, who identified the deceased and her sister among the figures, and ordered the drawing burned immediately as evidence of her persistent delusions. I carried out this task as instructed, but confessed to finding something more sad than shameful in this last comfort the poor woman had created for herself. This small act of creation, a last-ditch effort to remember a short time of happiness and equality in a society built to deny both, gives us perhaps the most human look into the inner lives of the people involved in this amazing case. Margaret's drawing, like the missing page from the family Bible and the burned letters, is now only an absence. It is known to history only because someone thought to write down how it was destroyed. Outside of academia, the Preston case is mostly forgotten today. It is a historical footnote that is overshadowed by bigger stories about the antebellum South and the Civil War that came after. There are no signs at the site of Willow Creek Plantation, and the foundations are slowly being overgrown by Georgia pine and kudzu. The family plot where Elizabeth and Margaret Preston are buried only has their names and birth years on their graves. There is no sign of the amazing choice they made or the price they paid for it. But there are still traces of 4 people who, for a short time in 1846, made a private world of equality and mutual recognition in the most unequal society in American history. These traces can be found in archives, oral histories, archaeological fragments, and marginalia. It was probably doomed from the start that they would try to bring that private reality into the open to live honestly in a time and place built on strategic denial and enforced silence. But their story, which has been preserved in bits and pieces over the course of 2 centuries, makes us think deeply about what love, resistance, and human dignity mean when society is so strict. When asked about the men from Willow Creek, Sarah Johnson said, "Some things are too terrible to keep in mind." Maybe she wasn't just talking about their physical fate, but also about the bigger tragedy their story represents. How a brief, fragile experiment in recognizing and treating everyone equally was crushed by a society that couldn't handle such a challenge. In October 1969, students from the University of Georgia's History Department held a small ceremony at the overgrown site of Willow Creek Plantation. There were academics, people who lived in the area, and a few descendants of people who used to be slaves there. They put a plain, unmarked stone at what archaeological evidence suggested was the entrance to the small, separate quarter where James and William probably lived. There were no speeches or plaques, but later, people who were there said they stood in silence as the sun set over the pine forest that had taken over the fields that used to grow cotton and indigo. One woman who was there, an elderly woman from the nearby Johnson plantation, was heard to say softly, they knew what they were doing, all 4 of them. They wanted to show what was possible, even though they knew it wasn't time yet. Sometimes that's all you can do. Plant a seed and hope someone remembers to water it long after you're gone. The story of Preston is still more than just a historical curiosity. It's a deep look at how people can be both cruel and brave when faced with entrenched systems of power. It makes us think about how societies force people to fit in, make resistance seem like a disease, and try to erase challenges to their core beliefs. Most poignantly, perhaps, it reminds us that behind the broad brushstrokes of historical narrative lie countless individual lives, some conforming to their times, others blazing briefly against the darkness of convention before being extinguished. As Elizabeth Preston wrote in her last preserved letter, Southern society will destroy what it cannot understand, and it understands precious little beyond its own narrow codes and hypocrisies. But I write this so that someone, someday, might know that in the spring of 1846, 4 people dared to live honestly on a plantation west of Savannah, creating a small world of equality within a larger one built on its opposite. That world lasted only 9 months before being crushed by the full weight of social, legal, and medical authority. But its memory, preserved in fragments across archives and generations, endures as a testament to the possibility of human connection across the most formidable barriers of caste and circumstance. and to the terrible price sometimes paid by those who dare to challenge a society not yet ready to change. The Georgia Historical Society still has the only surviving daguerreotype in its acid-free folder. It is simply labeled Unidentified Savannah Residence, circa 1845. The four faces look out across almost 2 centuries, with an expression that could be seen as defiance or as the quiet dignity of people who chose to live according to their own truth for a brief moment, rather than the comfortable lies of their time. Scholars are still debating and guessing about their names, stories, and even the exact nature of their relationships. But in that picture, which was saved by chance or oversight when so much else was purposely destroyed, they continue to show a possibility that was once seen and then violently suppressed. 4 people standing together as equals in a time and place where such equality was not only rare, but revolutionary. As the sun sets over the Georgia pines that now cover the former grounds of Willow Creek Plantation, one might imagine 4 people walking together in the cool of the evening. 2 women who society thought were too ugly to marry, and 2 men who society didn't think were fully human. All 4 of them created a small, fragile space between them where different rules applied. In Georgia in 1846, that space couldn't last, but its memory, which has survived against all odds, reminds us that even in the darkest times and places, people can sometimes rise above the fake walls that are put up to keep them in. In her last hours, Elizabeth Preston whispered, "I have nothing to repent. I really loved." Not many can say that.